you've now been through the MicroTech negotiation, and therefore you have a pretty good handle on what the context is. You negotiated over the transfer price for the technology going from household appliances to chips and components in order to take advantage to external opportunities that household appliances could not take advantage of on their own. And you may have noticed that household appliances wanted competitive protection for their own technology so that their rivals would not have it, and chips and components would have to agree to give up that revenue. And you may have noticed that there was also competitive protection for a third division, office automation, that was not invited to this particular negotiation. And I imagine we'll spend some time talking about it. They had a similar issue, that they had a different set of rivals that they wanted to get a competitive advantage by having chips and components agree not to sell to that group of rivals. Now, we will be talking down the road about why weren't they invited, and is that a normal thing to happen in organizations, and what might one do about it? Now, you have all had negotiation training, and therefore you have the advantage of understanding how to approach this kind of negotiation. And so you know that you want to look at the total value that could be created with each of the alternatives. And if you add up all the values across all the payoff tables, this is kind of what you see. So if we look at, for example, the competitive protection for household appliances, we see that 1 year of competitive protection has the maximum value across all of the roles, all of the payoff tables. If we look at office automation, even though they were not invited to the table, the implication is that there is a third payoff table for a party who was not invited to the table. And if we look across all of the payoff tables, including that missing one, but also you might have noticed that household appliances and chips and components have kind of a profit sharing benefit associated with office automation. If office automation does well, then some of that value gets distributed to other divisions in a small fashion, but some of it does get distributed. So in this case, if we look across all of them, we'll see that 4 years of competitive protection is optimal for that particular issue. So you might ask, what information did you in fact have about office automation? Well, better than perhaps most contexts in real organizations, you had most of the information you needed to make the best decision, including the value that would be created for office automation. If you look at your roles, you'll see that under the heading of NPV of the available deal options to your division, there is a sentence in each of your roles that describes the value that could be created for office automation. So for chips and components, in that paragraph, it says, office automation predicts a market share increase that it values at up to $40 million if the technology is kept from their rivals. So you know that relative to your payoffs, it's actually a pretty significant amount. For household appliances, Coleman knows that office automation is predicting a significant increase in market share if they can have the technology 4 years before rivals. So you know that it is up to 40 million and that its value is greatest at 4 years before the rivals. So you know it's a significant amount, and you know exactly how much competitive protection is required. But in your incentives, it's rather limited, not surprising, because your incentives focus on your division and perhaps minimize the incentives that other divisions get. So the profit sharing incentives it's not entirely trivial. It's up to $4 million if office automation gets $40 million. So it's how much more would you expect to create in such an incentive? And yet the $4 million that household appliances gets if the optimal agreement is reached for office automation, that $4 million pales compared to the direct incentives that household appliances would get for their issue, competitive protection for household appliances. And therefore, we have this question: would divisions invite all interested parties to the table given their druthers? Would it happen in your organizations? Is it normal to have important stakeholders not invited to the table? And if so, what would you do about it? Let's look at the results of the exercise. You had an opportunity here to create $100 million of new value in this exercise. And in this graph, in all cases, your group is the red bar, the Badger red bar. So let me start on the far right. If you look at the amount of the value, the percentage of the value that was left on the table, you'll see that it was around 30 to 40% of the value was left on the table. In this case, that means $30 to $40 million was left on the table. So let's look at how that happened. If we move to the far left side, we see how people did on the issue related to household appliances competitive protection. So for household appliances, it was how many years of competitive protection do you want to grant? And in this case, about 25% of the group was able to hit on the optimal level for that issue. Office automation was much more difficult because you had to think about the company as a whole as opposed to the specific payoffs to your division. In this case, none of the teams hit the optimal, which was more years of competitive protection. Not surprisingly, then, nobody hit on both issues. Nobody got both issues right. So we can see how the money was left on the table, if you will. Now, you might wonder, since I tricked you and didn't invite office automation to the negotiation, you might wonder, well, how much of the value that was left on the table is simply because of office automation? Well, if we separate that out, we see that about 20% of the value that's left on the table is just due to household appliances, which means about half of the value that wasn't created, that was failed to be created. Half of it is due to office automation, and half of it is due to failing to hit the optimal for household appliances. So it's pretty significant in both cases. These are both problems to solve. So we're going to turn now to how can we address these problems for MicroTech. A first thing that you might note is that you might want to train people on how to negotiate more effectively so that they leave less value on the table. But let's look at the other possibilities. So I think that most of you would agree that leaving 30 to 40% of the value on the table, in this case $30 to $40 million left on the table, is probably pretty significant. So at its core, I would argue that the key element of our task here going forward is what are our recommendations to MicroTech so that they can capture more of the value that was left on the table? And so breaking it out, I would identify really three critical factors that are causing the loss. The first one is managerial self-interest, and incorporated in that might be inefficient negotiation tactics. You're in the middle of learning negotiation, so you're actually unusually efficient in some of that. At the same time, some of the managerial self-interest works against, even with using effective negotiation techniques, it may work against us, particularly when we look at whether key stakeholders were not invited to the table. And negotiation tactics might tell you not to invite all the stakeholders to the table. It's not clear that the division managers would choose to involve someone whose interests would make the negotiation more complicated. In effect, it might be in the company's interest, but it might not be in the division manager's interest to do so. A third piece that I would overlay onto this, which is really important, I expect you'll understand it well, is that there is imperfect and asymmetric information about the value that can be created. And it's not just imperfect information between the division managers who are conducting the negotiation. There's also imperfect information, importantly, with corporate headquarters. And corporate headquarters cannot, in fact, impose an agreement on the divisions because they have even less information than the divisions have in trying to create that negotiation. To explore this problem, we're going to use the STAR framework shown here. Now, you'll see in the book that they discuss the McKinsey 7S framework. These are roughly interchangeable. There are some reasons why I happen to like this one a little bit better, but if you like the other one better, then that's fine too. let me just go through this really quickly. The top is identifying the strategy, and the notion is that all of the elements or levers of the organization need to be aligned to that strategy. So we need to have a structure in place that promotes the coordination and oversight that's required to achieve the strategy. We need to have processes such that information flows in the organization, that we are collecting the right information in the organization to support our strategy. We need to have rewards or incentives that are aligned with what we need people to do with respect to our strategy. In terms of people, we need to have the right people. We need to hire and attract and hire the right people. We need to move them through the organization, through careers in our organization, consistent with the strategy. And frankly, we have to get rid of or fire people who are not acting in alignment with the strategy that we need. And the last point is symbols. Symbols is, I'm going to go into a little bit more detail, but it's basically saying to what extent are our core values aligned with the strategy that we want to achieve, and the symbols or the values need to be aligned with the structure, the processes, the rewards, the people, etc. To drill down on the notion of symbols, I want you to understand a little story about what happened at Samsung. So early in we now think of them as a high-end phone producer. Some of you may have Samsung phones. I used to myself. And we think of them as high quality now. But initially, they produced a spate of really low-quality phones. And the CEO was concerned and felt that they needed to have higher quality standards in the organization. So he wanted something that people would take notice of. So in their factory, he had them drag $50 million worth of unsold phone inventory into the courtyard of their factory, and he set it ablaze. And it is still a story that's told at Samsung, and since that point, Samsung has been much more focused on quality since then. I tell you this story because when we say symbols, sometimes we think of what I might call cheap talk. Here, this was obviously very expensive. It was costly to create a story that was going to change the culture at the company. And this story gets told and retold, so one might argue that as expensive as it was worth every cent. So in class, your teams are going to explore what can MicroTech do to increase cooperation and collaboration across divisions, in particular to reduce the amount of value that's left on the table in this kind of context. So we'll use the STAR framework, and each team will have a lever of the STAR, if you will. So the people lever will focus on who would you hire to enhance collaboration, who might you have to fire, and how would you socialize the people that are on board. The second lever is rewards, and we want to look more broadly at the various financial awards, non-financial awards, recognition, perks, remembering that we already have a profit-sharing incentive for the divisions, and that doesn't seem to be enough. The third lever is processes, and we'll look at what is it that you might need to measure, what kinds of policies and procedures might you need to have in place, managerial accounting systems, what might you need to know in order to promote cooperation and coordination. The fourth lever is the structure. What kinds of reporting relationships need to be in place? What kinds of coordinating roles, liaisons, teams, committees? How would you promote coordination across divisions through the structure? And finally, we have symbols, which is, as we said, the communication, symbolic actions, rituals that would emphasize the importance of coordination to the company. And you need to recognize that these need to be things that are taken very seriously, nothing that makes people's eyes roll. They might require rather significant commitments for them to be taken seriously. So that's all for now. In class, we'll return to this, and I look forward to seeing you then.